Over the past week or so since Starfield is fully released to the public, there have been a lot of opinions emerging about Starfield, its gameplay, whether or not it's a good or a bad game. I do have my early first impressions that are available on the channel. You can check out that video if you're interested, but I do see a lot of stupidity, a lot of legitimate complaints, as well as a lot of praise where people are calling Starfield the game of the generation, the best Bethesda game ever made, and among many other titles and accolades that it is receiving. A 10 out of 10 for a lot of people. How is it going, everybody? My name is DeMarco, and today we're sitting down to have a conversation about the nature of subjectivity, which for some reason when a massive video game launches, especially so when it's a console exclusive, seems to get thrown completely out the window and forgotten about. So without further ado, let's get into it. I wanted to start by recognizing first some of the criticisms that the game has. And I wanted to begin not just with the criticisms, with the stupid criticisms, of which there are many involving Starfield. There are quite a few, and it's impossible to talk about some of the complaints the game is receiving without diving into, for example, the review bombings that it has received. If you take a look at the overall Metacritic score so far, you can notice that the user scores are consistently underwhelming, many people rating it as a 0. If you take a look at some of the complaints that are being listed, you'll see several that are discussing the outdated engine that Bethesda uses, and these are probably the first folks who have no idea how a game engine works or what it entails, and basically have never actually spent time looking into the legitimacy of that argument. You'll see many other people who are saying, well, it just feels like Skyrim in space, even though that's one of the first things that Bethesda said about Starfield. The list goes on and on. Now, I've never thought that Metacritic was a good platform to judge a game review on in general. It kind of gives a window, but it's by no means an objective source of information to determine how people feel about a certain game. There are also people who have never played Starfield or haven't really given it a chance that are offering their opinions and trying to weigh out whether or not it's a good or bad title. In some cases, it's come to the attention of fans, such as this interview which was done.
Not far in it, but I want to say one thing though. The game is, so far, based on word of mouth, reviews, it's a disappointment.
Okay.
I don't think it's a bad game, but it is a disappointment considering.
I mean, how much have you played?
Like 3 hours. Like 3 hours.
I'm not one of those people that thinks you need to play a game for 30 plus hours before you can even start to form a legitimate opinion on a title. It obviously depends on the game. A small indie game versus a 100-hour open world RPG like Starfield, your mileage is going to vary. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that 3 hours for a game like Starfield is not nearly enough time. That's not just exclusive for Starfield, that goes for probably most open world games that you've probably ever played. And I would actually say one interesting bit of praise is that most people say Starfield gets better the more you play, versus a lot of games where people start to teeter out and get bored the longer because repetition starts to get in, the stories become to get repetitive, that sort of thing. So Starfield being in it for the long haul and improving over time is actually a stellar compliment.
First of all, I thought the intro was horrendous. I think the writing.
What about the intro? What about the intro was horrendous?
It just was very lackluster. Like, if you compare it to Skyrim, immediately you're fighting a dragon.
For Skyrim, the unique feature, the big plot line involved dragons. That was one of the first things that we found out about it from the early trailers and teasers that we got for Skyrim, and thus it was reflected in the intro. In Starfield, it's the mystery of these artifacts. So you have very different tones in the games, and you have very different approaches to how they kick off. Yes, it's a little bit slower than getting chased by a dragon. He says fight it. You can't fight it, it's just, you can in the intro, you can only run. One of the cooler, more unique things about Starfield going into it is we actually have no idea who the antagonist of the game is. If you look at any of the promotional material, you can't tell me who the main enemy for Starfield, and I like that about it. So they're not going to throw this dragon equivalent creature right at you from the beginning of the game. One, people would then say it's way too similar to Skyrim, and two, I'm actually kind of tired of this cliche of the opening of games. Here's the enemy, here's the threat, then he gets away from you after he does some bad thing, and now you go off and chase him for the rest of the game. I actually thought Starfield's opening was quite refreshing, that it's just, hey, we gotta find these pieces and it's gonna open a puzzle, and you have this Indiana Jones-like adventure that you go on. So, to each their own.
Whereas this is a little bit, like I said, it's a little more shallow, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit almost more like Mass Effect, where it's more story-oriented, it's pushing you in a certain direction.
Do you think that was the choices you made? What is her name? Lynn or Lim, the lady who's your boss? Do you think part of it is just that, the fact that she asked you to burn the bodies and it should be more of a choice versus she forces you to do it and it's almost like it's scripted at that point?
That's some of it.
I mean, that didn't happen at all in the game, so I'm assuming you haven't played it yet, correct?
No, I swear to God, I played it, but it's
wow.
When you...
I know it's ridiculous. You know it's ridiculous. Most people know that it's ridiculous. And it's just important. The reason why I bring this up is because there are a lot of these types of takes out there that are trying to masquerade themselves as facts, or as though people have experienced what Starfield has to offer and are coming up with valid opinions on the game, and that's simply not the case. I think this is a good time to bring up Corey S.A. and a tweet that he made on Twitter a while ago. I have referenced this in the past, but I think it's something people easily forget. For those who don't know, he is the director of player engagement at 1047 Games, so definitely a verifiable, reasonable person to trust this information from. He mentions that comp/creators equal 2 to 3% of players, casual/all others 97 to 98%. Of players who say nothing, 80 to 90%. Again, most people who are playing Starfield are legitimately doing so on their own terms, quietly enjoying the game, and that's evident by the 6 million players that have played Starfield so far. But there are also some legitimate complaints with Starfield, and while I see a lot of folks who are giving a 10 out of 10, a perfect game, game of the generation, I absolutely think there are flaws here, as with any game. For example, there's a review on Steam that I really liked, and while I don't agree with 100% of it, there is certain sections that I did want to pull out and show with all of you today. This one highlights that Bethesda has always been fantastic at making their worlds feel lived in. They add history to every location, add a story to be told, whether it's an ancient dungeon, a capital city, or a car factory that raiders just so happen to take up refuge in. There's always seemed to be a reason for these locations to exist, aside for simply being for the player to discover. I think many of you can see exactly what direction this is going in. Unfortunately, generated content has taken their biggest strength and stretched it so thin, the other cracks in their armor become much more apparent. The interesting handcrafted overworlds have been turned into vast expanses of boredom, populated only by alien life that wanders aimlessly and dotted with copy and pasted locations on each planet. The reason for each of these enemies or locations to exist are gone. Instead, they are placed there based on the algorithm saying this planet needs a predator and drawing from a handful of randomized creatures to fill the role, or it needs an outpost, so it takes the same biolaboratory you saw on a planet at level 5 and has it appear again at level 50 with higher level enemies. It's a sentiment that I can agree with, and while there's a lot of folks who are enjoying these random procedural locations, there's a lot of folks who find excitement by running across a random base, even if it is the same thing but shooting the enemies, because the gunplay in the game is legitimately pretty fun, because looting is exciting. Whatever reason that they enjoy it, again, it all comes down to subjective opinions. Meanwhile, there are several things that we should be praising about Starfield that I think it does really well, especially if you're a fan of Bethesda games and the Bethesda game style format, which some have used as an argument to call Starfield dated, even though it's exactly what myself and many others want to see. But as for genuine compliments and recognizing some of the facts about Starfield and some of the positive elements that are here, it is one of the top selling games on Steam. In fact, right now, if you look, it is the top selling game on Steam. It has a phenomenal player count. It's reached an all-time peak just this Sunday, which yesterday, if you're watching this video when it releases, of 330,723 players. And we also know Bethesda active and Xbox actively tweeted out that Starfield has had over 6 million players join the journey among the stars, which is a massive accomplishment. It's been touted as being Bethesda's biggest release of all time, surpassing the likes of Skyrim and Fallout 4, which is incredible for Bethesda, and I think deservedly so. And naturally, everyone always tries to assume and play fun at the idea that developers want other games to fail. In this case, naturally, two big RPGs, even though they're completely different games entirely, Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield, they assume that one developer is hopeful that the other game will fail so that theirs does better. That's not the case. Developers want good games. Developers play other studios' games. It's just the nature of the industry. David Jaffe, I apologize, I actually don't know the correct pronunciation on this one. He is the former game director for God of War and the co-creator of the Twisted Metal series, of course, both PlayStation titles.
Let me just cut to the chase. It's the best single-player video game I've ever played. I adore it. It is one of my favorites ever.
If you're able to look past most of the console war shenanigans that most of us, even you guys watching this video, you can see through pretty clearly, you'll find the reality of Starfield and whether or not it's a good or bad game, whether or not it's going to appeal to you. But there's this ongoing narrative where people seem to think that it needs to be a perfect game, or because it doesn't respond exactly the same as other titles do. For example, I have seen clips going around of people commenting on the nature of NPCs when you pull out a weapon in Starfield versus in Cyberpunk. And in Cyberpunk, all the NPCs will run and they'll flee as soon as you start waving a weapon around, but in Starfield, they just sort of meander. They don't really care. You can even fire it next to them, and unless you hit somebody, people don't panic, and therefore Starfield is a bad game. That's not. It's not how any game should be looked at. That's not how any game should be criticized. There's a comment to be made that I would appreciate if the NPC reactivity was a bit more lively, especially for these realistic worlds and these realistic sandbox simulations that Bethesda is trying to create on some level. And that's a fair criticism, but you can't say that the game is bad just because it doesn't respond like another game. I think we saw this same type of stupidity with Halo 5, I believe it was, where people were shooting watermelons or something, fruit baskets, and the fruit didn't respond the same way it did in Call of Duty. I can't remember the exact example, but some of you might know what I'm talking about. For every complaint, legitimate complaint that I would have about Starfield, or that other people might raise about Starfield, there's 3 things that I love about the game. This is honestly the last and only video I will make on the subject, but I thought I had to talk about it at least one time. And aside from that, while it's not a 10 out of 10 game for me personally, I do unapologetically love the time that I've been spending in Starfield. I always can't wait to hop back in, have more adventures with my character. You can check out an entire Let's Play series that I'm doing on a secondary channel if you're interested. I just wish that there was an opportunity to elevate discussions beyond this petty discourse that we're currently seeing online. So let me know what your favorite things about Starfield are. That's what I would like to hear most about. Let's keep it positive. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I hope to see you all next time. So long, everybody.